Hello and welcome. My name is Amy White, and I'm going to be discussing the Congregationalist Church. The Congregationalist Church is a denomination of the Protestant Faith beginning around 1500 when they broke from the Roman Catholic and Anglican Church, citing their disdain for the adherence to the Pope and the Monarch of England. For the Congregationalists, they felt the church should be led by Jesus Christ alone. The early Congregationalists in England faced religious persecution. The first Congregationalists came to the New World in the 1620s as pilgrims. The early Congregationalists in the New World quickly spread their faith as the people of the frontier appreciated having greater say in the teachings and practices of their church, rather than through the mandates of monarchs or popes. The migration of the Congregationalists into the state of Ohio, where I live, drew from the New England region, with the first Congregationalist church being built in 1809 in Marietta, Ohio. By the 1820s, the Congregationalist churches were well established in most of Ohio's major cities and towns. The most important Congregationalist in Ohio during the 19th century was David Bacon, who actively sought Native American converts to Congregationalism. In Ohio, the Congregationalists were early advocates for higher education, establishing Oberlin College in 1833, Marietta College in 1835, and Defiance College in 1850. At the close of the 19th century, as with most of the world, America was transforming into an industrial society. Masses of immigrants, both foreign and domestic, were surging into the cities to fill factory and industrial positions. The result was the growing disparity between the wealthy and the poor, made evident by the rise of slums and crumbling social infrastructures for these poor average workers. Christians responded in various ways to the growing crisis, resulting in various city missions to minister to the growing and diverse city population. Then others turned to mass evangelism like D.L. Moody and mass urban revivals brought in the middle classes, which ultimately did not appeal to the immigrant masses. During this time, theology too transitioned in response to these new times and circumstances with the emergence of social gospel, where the few liberal ministers began to preach that if Christians took Jesus' teaching seriously, they would address working conditions in American factories and immigrant slums as a call to action. The principles of the social gospel took many forms, including campaigns for child labor laws, factory safety legislation, stricter tenement housing codes, public health regulations, and the principles of the social gospel was not just to seek salvation through religious teachings, but also putting those teachings into action. Washington Gladden was the senior pastor of the First Congregational Church of Columbus, Ohio. Over the years, the Congregational Church in Ohio grew, setting up the First Congregational Church in Ohio when in the late 1840s, a growing movement of Christian abolitionists were gaining strength, and they realized that spiritually they were no longer Presbyterian. With a small loan from the Second Presbyterian Church of Columbus, the members left the church and founded the First Congregational Church of Columbus. The church bought a lot of land down the street from the Ohio Capitol building, and on December 23, 1857, they dedicated their new building at 73 East Broad Street, Columbus, Ohio. Over the years, the church flourished and was pastored by successful and lively and articulate ministers, but none of them left a meaningful legacy as that of Rev Dr Washington Gladden, who pastored the church from 1882 until his death in 1918. In his youth, Washington Gladden grew up in a highly revivalist region with vivid memories of the popular Baptist revivalist Jacob Knapp that left the young Gladden unimpressed with his fire and brimstone rhetoric. indeed shaping the young Gladden's personal faith and theology. Gladden's theology perspective was revolutionary in his day. He saw the gospel as not intended merely for salvation of individuals, but also for the transformation of society. Gladden was not a socialist, but sought to structure social reform through Christian ethics and the golden rule to reform society. Gladden wanted to find the middle way of reforming society as a socially conscious Christian nation. Gladden's work as a minister took him to urban centers, working with average working men and women. He fought for injustice from the pulpit. In 1882, Gladden moved from New England to the First Congregationalist Church of Columbus, Ohio, and though unmoved by his surroundings, Columbus was the political capital of the state, as well as the academic hub of the state too, which Gladden felt made Columbus the natural rallying center for the charitable forces of the state. Plus, the congregation of the First Congregational Church of Columbus was made up predominantly of comfortable middle-class people that were not the working class he worked for or fought for, but rather their bosses, which gave Gladden the ability to make a difference amongst the decision makers on behalf of the working class. And that is not a task he took lightly. Gladden used the pulpit to rally for the working class, speaking out against the ownership and management of the hawking coal industry during a strike, calling on better wages and treatment for the strikers, and he was heard eventually, and they made changes. Gladden felt that if corporations fail to serve the public interest, then their power must too be taken away from them at whatever cost, because ultimately corporations must be held accountable for public interest because they only exist because of the working classes. Gladden often plunged into the religious controversies of his day, siding firmly with the so-called modernists and rejecting fundamentalist claims that the Bible was literally dictated by God and inherent in every detail. Gladden insisted that the Bible was not infallible historically, scientifically, or morally. From the pulpit, Gladden covered a range of topics, preaching remarkable devotional sermons on prayer, the Bible, evangelism, and missions. And on Sunday evenings, he would preach about collective bargaining, house inspections, pure milk, elections, coal miners, and streetcar workers, and the treatment of blacks, and the question of war and peace. Gladden's impact on Christendom was in his deep and abiding development of liberal theology that led others to break from Congregationalists into other denominations, but led Congregationalists to a steadfast adherence to Christ's teachings and putting those practices into action. Since Gladden, the legacy of the church lays with the congregation of the First Congregational Church and their commitment to serve the Lord their God with all their hearts, mind, soul, and strength, and their unyielding commitment to the ministries of their church and the missions that they serve over the past 150 years. Thanks so much for listening.